The day she showed up at my farm, I had no idea my life was about to change. It was a typical afternoon, and I was doing what I did best, fixing an old tractor covered in grease, sweat dripping down my back, lost in the quiet solitude of the Nebraska plains. My name is Ethan Miller, and for the past 3 years, I've been running the family farm in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. My parents had passed away in a car accident back in 2022, and just like that, the weight of everything they had worked for landed squarely on my shoulders. I stayed because this farm was the last piece of them I had. It wasn't glamorous, just a few hundred acres of corn and wheat, but it was mine, and that was enough. Life on the farm was simple but demanding. Before the sun came up, I fed the animals, mended fences the wind had torn down, and prayed for the crops to grow strong enough to weather another season. Most days it was just me, the land, and the endless Nebraska sky. I didn't need much more than that, or so I thought. That afternoon in late March felt like every other. The sun was unusually warm for the season, the dry air carrying the earthy scent of dust and soil. I was elbow-deep in grease, working on the tractor, the hum of a country song drifting from the radio. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway was the first thing that caught my attention. People didn't just stop by. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked up to see a sleek black SUV pulling into the driveway. It was so polished, so out of place on my dirt road, I thought for a second it might be a mistake. The door opened, and out stepped a woman. She was tall, dressed sharp in a blazer and heels that immediately sank into the soft ground. Her auburn hair was tied back neatly, but her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her bag. What caught my attention most was her eyes. They were sharp, focused but tired, like she hadn't slept in days. She made her way toward me with careful steps, trying not to stumble on the uneven ground. "Are you Ethan Miller?" she asked. I nodded, still confused by the unexpected visit. "That's me. Can I help you?" Quote. She took a deep breath, glancing around at the farm before locking her gaze on me. "My name is Clare Whitmore. I need a husband by tomorrow." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, staring at her in disbelief. The rag slipped from my hands, hanging there uselessly. For a second, I thought it had to be a joke or some kind of scam, but there was no hint of humor on her face. She wasn't laughing. "I'm sorry," I said, blinking slowly. "You need what?" Instead of backing down, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder, handing it to me. "If I am not married by my 29th birthday, which is tomorrow, I lose control of my company." I stared down at the folder, flipping through the pages in a daze. Legal documents, a will, news articles. The Whitmore Group. I knew that name. It was a massive agricultural corporation based out of Lincoln, Nebraska. Their land bordered my own, but I had never imagined someone from their world would be standing on my farm. Claire continued. "My grandfather built it. His will says I must be married to retain control. If not, it goes to my cousin, Ryan Whitmore." I handed the folder back to her, my mind racing. "Why me? You don't even know me." She hesitated, her gaze softening just slightly. "Your farm borders one of our properties. I researched you. You're independent, not connected to industry politics, and you're someone who can't be bought. My ex-fiancé left last week when I refused to sign deals that would hurt small farmers. Ryan would destroy everything my grandfather built." I leaned against the fence, trying to process what she had just told me. Ryan Whitmore. I'd heard the stories. Buyouts, land grabs, families forced off their land. The same kind of people my parents had fought against their whole lives. "So what are you asking?" I said, still reeling. "Legal marriage," she replied, her voice steady. "On paper, we register tomorrow. Lawyers handle the rest. Once I secure the board, we can quietly annul it." I shook my head, the weight of what she was asking sinking in. "I'm not doing this for money." Claire's eyes didn't waver. "If I agree, there are no lies. And if it becomes real, it's because we choose it." I was silent for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. Her words were direct, but the intensity behind them left no room for doubt. She wasn't just desperate, she was determined. Without saying a word, I extended my hand. We shook hands right there by the barn, and her palm was cool against my rough skin. I had no idea it would be the start of something that would change both of our lives forever. The morning after our handshake, everything felt like a dream. Or maybe more like a nightmare. I couldn't quite tell. Claire and I drove into town just after sunrise. The sky was pale pink over the fields, and the road was quiet, save for the hum of her SUV. Neither of us spoke much. It wasn't awkward, just strange. We were two strangers, heading to a courthouse to get married, with no love story, no family gathered, no celebration waiting afterward. The county courthouse in Scottsbluff was small and plain, just a brick building with flags out front and a few cars in the parking lot. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a small town. Claire's lawyer was already waiting inside, along with one of my neighbors, Tom, who had agreed to be a witness after I asked him for a favor. I didn't explain it to him then, not really. I just told him I needed help, and he'd always been the kind of guy to show up when asked. The ceremony was fast. No rings, no vows beyond what the law required. The judge smiled kindly at us, a local man who had known my family for years, then handed us the paperwork. "You're married," he said simply. "Congratulations." Claire looked relieved, but there was still tension in her shoulders. She walked out of the courtroom, still a little stiff, like she was bracing herself for something. I could see it in the way she moved. This wasn't how anyone imagined starting a marriage, especially someone like her. But it was done. By the time we got back to the farm, the paperwork was already filed. Claire's legal team worked fast, and statements were being drafted for the Whitmore Group board to confirm that the will had been satisfied. Her shoulders were still tense as she stared out the window of the SUV, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee. "I appreciate this, Ethan," she said quietly. "More than you know." I glanced at her. "I just want things clear," I replied. "If this is going to work, we need rules." She nodded, and for a moment I thought we might actually get through this without any more surprises. But nothing about this felt normal. The next few days felt like walking on a tightrope, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, just waiting to change everything. The first few days after the marriage were awkward, to say the least. Claire had gone back to Lincoln to pack and handle some business, leaving me alone on the farm to think about everything that had happened. The house felt just as empty as it always had. I slept poorly, replaying every moment in my head, wondering if I had just made the smartest or dumbest decision of my life. I was used to being alone on the farm, but this was different. A stranger was now living under my roof, and not just any stranger. Clare Whitmore, a woman with a corporation at her back and a complicated past that I still didn't fully understand. She came back the next morning, 2 suitcases in hand, a serious look on her face. I could tell something had changed in her. She wasn't the same woman who had stepped onto my farm a few days ago. She was no longer just here for the marriage. She was here to stay. "Ryan's already moving," she said as we carried her bags inside. "He hired investigators. If this marriage looks fake, he will challenge it in court. I need to stay here full-time." I showed her the guest room, my parents' old bedroom. It felt strange, opening that door for someone else. I hadn't let anyone in that room since my parents died. It was where they'd spent their nights, the walls lined with their memories. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't let myself get caught up in them. This was just temporary, I told myself. Claire was just here to protect the farm and her grandfather's legacy. The first few days after that were nothing short of strange. Our worlds could not have been more different. I was up before dawn every morning, pulling on my boots and heading straight for the barn. Claire, on the other hand, started her days later, brewing coffee in my old percolator and jumping into video calls with lawyers and board members. She sounded confident, sharp, as though she were used to commanding a room. Meanwhile, I'd be outside, covered in dirt and sweat, trying to make sure the fence stayed standing. We barely spoke beyond the basics. "Coffee's ready. The internet is slow. The fence needs fixing." She wasn't rude, but we were strangers who'd just signed a contract, not a couple who had any kind of connection. I guess I'd thought we'd talk more, but the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was just there. Then, on the third day, something shifted. I was out in the field, trying to fix a section of fence when Claire appeared beside me. She was wearing jeans and a simple shirt, holding a thermos. She looked out of place, like someone who didn't belong in this world. But there was a determination in her eyes that told me she wasn't going anywhere. "Mind if I help?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I hesitated for a moment. She was the last person I expected to see out here, especially not with a pair of gloves and a thermos. But I handed her a pair, unsure if she would last 5 minutes. To my surprise, she asked questions. She listened. She learned. When she pricked her finger once, she cursed under her breath, but then she laughed it off and kept going. That night, she tried cooking dinner. The eggs were a little burnt, but we laughed about it. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had, and I found myself easing into her company more than I expected. She told me about her grandfather, about his vision for protecting small farms, how important that legacy was to her. I told her about my parents and the droughts they'd survived. It was the first time we'd really shared anything personal. It wasn't much, but it was enough to shift something between us. Just a little. A crack in the walls we'd built around ourselves. But things were about to get a lot harder. The pressure started building quickly after that. Claire and I were still getting used to each other's presence, but now there were more important things to worry about than awkward silences. Ryan was pushing hard to prove our marriage was a fraud, and the story started circulating. I heard whispers in town about me, about how I was just a greedy farmer, using Claire for her money and power. Some of the locals I'd known my whole life were starting to look at me differently. But it wasn't the rumors that hurt. It was the idea that people thought Claire and I weren't real, that the bond we were beginning to form was just part of the act. Claire didn't back down, though. She stood by me in ways I didn't expect. She went out of her way to defend us publicly, even when it meant standing in front of reporters and questioning her own decisions. She tied her reputation to mine without hesitation. And that wasn't just because of the marriage. It was because she actually believed in what we were doing. She wanted to protect what was important, not just for her grandfather, but for farmers like my parents. And then came the sabotage. One morning I woke up to find the irrigation pipes had been sliced clean through. Water flooded the fields, ruining half of the young crops I had been so careful with. My heart sank as I stood there, watching the water pour out, knowing the damage would be costly. I could feel my frustration building. This wasn't just an accident. It was an attack. When I told Claire, her face hardened immediately. "It's him," she said, her voice low. "He's escalating." And she was right. I had no doubt it was Ryan. This was the kind of dirty trick he was known for, the kind of ruthless behavior that had earned him the fear of the entire farming community. But even with all this weight pressing down on us, something inside me shifted. Claire's resolve surprised me more every day. She didn't run away from problems. She faced them head on. She stayed at my side, helping to find a solution, figuring out the next step, even though she could have easily walked away at any point. There was no pretending now. This wasn't just some business arrangement anymore. It was real. Then came the fire. I was out in the barn, fixing some equipment. When I smelled smoke, my heart stopped. I sprinted toward the storage shed, only to find flames already licking the walls. I grabbed the nearest extinguisher and began fighting the fire, but it was no use. The wind was against me, and the flames were spreading too fast. By the time the fire department arrived, the damage was done. We lost most of the equipment and all of the seeds we had been preparing for the next season. I collapsed into the mud, exhausted, my hands burned and shaking. And then I heard Claire's voice. She rushed over to me, panic written all over her face. She was crying, her hands trembling as she knelt beside me, checking me over, making sure I wasn't seriously hurt. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If I hadn't gotten you involved." I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "No, we'll fix this. We'll fix this together." That night, as the wind howled outside, I realized something. I wasn't just protecting a farm anymore. I wasn't just fighting to keep what was mine. I was fighting for her, Claire. The deal wasn't a deal anymore. It had stopped being just about business. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing her as just a stranger I had agreed to marry for the sake of a will. I was in this for her. For us. The days after the fire felt like a blur. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Claire, too, seemed to be running on empty, but she didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. Instead of retreating back to her world in Lincoln, she stayed. She stayed because she knew the farm needed her, and so did I. She used her own money to replace the damaged equipment. Every receipt was meticulously tracked, every payment transparent. She was doing all the things I couldn't do alone, but she wasn't doing it for me. She was doing it for the farm, for the legacy she was trying to protect. It felt like we were finally in sync. We weren't just two strangers living under the same roof anymore. We were partners. But the world wasn't going to make it easy for us. Ryan didn't stop. He filed a petition, challenging the legitimacy of our marriage, claiming it was a fraud. He pushed for an emergency hearing, one that would drag us through court and force us to prove that everything we had done was real. The press was all over it, painting us as liars, questioning everything from our marriage to my farm. It felt like every time I looked up, another reporter was standing at the gate, trying to get a picture, trying to get a story. The weight of it all pressed down on us, but Claire didn't flinch. She faced it head on, like she always did. And then, it happened. The moment that would change everything. Claire had been on the phone with her lawyer when I found her in the living room, her face drained of color. Her hand was shaking as she held the phone to her ear. "They've scheduled it," she said quietly, lowering the phone. "An emergency hearing with the board. If we don't have proof of a real marriage, if they think this was all for show, I'll lose everything." My stomach twisted. We had 48 hours. 48 hours to prove that everything we'd built in the past few weeks was real. It felt impossible. That night, we worked through the documents, the photos, the affidavits from our neighbors. Tom from the farm down the road signed one, as did others who had seen us together over the past month. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Claire stayed calm, even as the stress started to eat at her. She was used to this kind of pressure. She'd been through business negotiations, boardrooms, and deal-making before. But this was different. This was personal. It was about her family, about the legacy her grandfather had built. And now it was about us. The real battle, though, wasn't in the papers or the legal files. It was emotional. It was the fear of losing everything we'd just begun. That night, as the moonlight filtered through the curtains, Claire and I sat on the porch, the evening air warm and thick with the scent of freshly cut hay. The wind was still, and for once, the world felt quiet. Claire broke the silence first. "What if we lose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we lose the company, everything?" I looked at her, my heart heavy with the weight of her question. This wasn't just about a company or a farm anymore. This was about our future. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice raw with uncertainty. "But I do know this. This isn't just some deal for me anymore. I never thought it would be, but it is now. It's real, Claire. It's real." Her eyes widened, and she turned to face me fully. For the first time since we'd met, I could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the cracks in the tough exterior she'd built to protect herself. Slowly, she reached out, taking my hand in hers. "I'm scared, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I've spent so much time protecting everything, keeping control. And now, I don't know what will happen if I lose it all." I squeezed her hand, my thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." Her gaze softened as she looked at me. It wasn't the look of a business partner or a woman who had just been through a legal arrangement. It was something deeper, something more real. And then, for the first time, I realized it wasn't just her protecting something anymore. We were protecting each other. The hearing took place in Lincoln, and the pressure was unbearable. I couldn't remember the last time my heart had pounded like this, or when the weight of everything had felt so heavy. The 2 days leading up to the hearing were a whirlwind of preparation. Claire's lawyers worked non-stop, gathering every shred of evidence they could to prove that our marriage wasn't just a formality. We had affidavits, photos, testimonies from neighbors, and financial records that showed our shared commitment to the farm. But even with all that, I couldn't shake the fear that it wouldn't be enough. What if the board saw right through us? What if Ryan had planted something that would tear us apart? The night before the hearing, Claire and I sat together on the porch, the warm evening air wrapping around us. The field stretched out before us, and I could hear the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. There was something peaceful about the moment, even as the storm of uncertainty swirled around us. Claire turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "If we lose," she said, her voice barely audible, "I'll lose everything, my grandfather's legacy, the company, and you'll—" I cut her off, reaching for her hand. "We won't lose." Her lips parted, but no words came out. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I had felt earlier, the fear of losing control, of losing everything we'd worked so hard for. But I knew something she didn't. "We're not losing, Claire," I repeated firmly, "because we've already won. We're already here, and whatever happens in that hearing tomorrow, we'll handle it. Together." Quote. She squeezed my hand, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw the trust in her eyes. It wasn't just about the farm anymore, or the business arrangement. It was about us. We had built something real, something no one could take from us, no matter what happened. The next morning, we stood in front of the board in a cold, sterile room. Ryan sat across from us, his smug smile barely masking the arrogance in his eyes. He called our marriage a sham, a desperate attempt to protect a business deal. He painted me as a small-time farmer, someone who was only in it for the money. But then Claire stood up. Her voice was steady as she admitted that our marriage had started out of necessity, that she needed to protect her grandfather's legacy. But then she said something I wasn't expecting. "I've fallen in love with him," Claire said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Not for power, not for control, but because he treated me like an equal. Because he's fought for everything he has, and I respect that." The room went silent. Even Ryan seemed taken aback, his confidence faltering for the first time. Claire wasn't just defending our marriage, she was defending us. Before Ryan could react, Claire's lawyer presented the final piece of evidence. Security footage from the farm showed someone setting the fire, someone whose voice was caught on audio. It was Ryan's voice. The room erupted into chaos as the evidence unfolded. Bank records followed, showing bribes and manipulation tied directly to Ryan. His face drained of color as the authorities entered the room, and just like that, his empire began to crumble. The board suspended the hearing immediately, and an hour later, they reconvened. Ryan was removed from the company, and Claire was officially in control. The marriage was declared valid, and the threat hanging over us was finally lifted. When the call ended, Claire collapsed into my arms. Her body shook with relief, and I held her tighter, knowing that everything we had fought for was finally ours. She pulled back, her eyes full of tears. "We did it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We really did it." Quote. And in that moment, I realized that we had. But it wasn't just about the farm anymore. It wasn't about the company or the legal papers or even the boardroom battles. It was about us, about what we had built together, not out of necessity but out of choice. Claire stayed with me after the hearing. She didn't go back to Lincoln, not for business, not for anything. She stayed on the farm, and slowly, over time, she became as much a part of this place as I was. The press quieted down, the noise of Ryan's accusations fading into the background. The farm felt different now, like it could finally breathe again. And so could we. Months passed, and everything settled into a routine. Claire kept fighting for small farmers, restructuring the company to focus on sustainability and fairness. She never pushed me into her world unless I asked. She respected the farm, just as I respected her work. Then, as the anniversary of our courthouse wedding approached, Claire and I made a decision, not because of a will or a contract, but because we wanted to. We held a ceremony right on the farm, under the wide Nebraska sky. No luxury, no pressure, just wildflowers, string lights, and neighbors and friends. Claire wore a simple white dress that danced with the wind, and I wore clean boots and a nervous smile. The same judge who had married us a year ago officiated, and we wrote our own vows, honest ones, about choosing each other, standing together through the storms, and building something real. When I slipped the ring on her finger, I realized how far we had come. What started as a desperate need had turned into something more than either of us had ever expected. It had turned into love. As we stood there, hand in hand, under the sky that had witnessed it all, I knew one thing for sure. She hadn't just come asking for a husband. She had come asking for a partner. And now, that's exactly what we were.